Have you ever watched someone struggle with something that seems completely obvious to you and felt that uncomfortable mix of frustration and guilt for being frustrated? Maybe it was a coworker who kept making the same mistake no matter how many times it was explained, or a family member who just couldn't seem to grasp things that felt, to you, like basic common sense. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you wondered, what is actually going on inside their head? Not cruelly, just genuinely. What does the world look like from in there? Today, we're going to answer that question. And I promise you, what psychology actually tells us about people with extremely low IQ is so much more nuanced, so much more human, and honestly, so much more fascinating than anything you've probably assumed. Because the truth is, most of us have been handed a cartoon version of this story, and the real one is worth knowing. Let's start by dismantling the biggest myth right at the door. Low IQ does not mean a person is simply a slower version of you, running the same software on a weaker machine. That's the intuition most people carry around, and it's fundamentally wrong. Research in cognitive psychology suggests that very low IQ, we're talking scores roughly below 70, what clinicians used to call intellectual disability, isn't just about speed. It's about a fundamentally different architecture of processing the world. The brain isn't slower. In certain ways, it's wired differently. Think of it like this. Imagine you and a friend are both trying to navigate a city. You have a full map with street names, landmarks, and GPS. Your friend has the same city, but their map only shows major roads, no street names, fewer landmarks, and no zoom function. They can still get around. They know their neighborhood deeply. They might even know shortcuts you'd never find on your map. But ask them to navigate somewhere new and abstract, and the experience is genuinely different. Not because they're lazy or broken, but because the tool they're working with processes spatial information differently. That's closer to what's actually happening neurologically. Studies on individuals with intellectual disabilities consistently show differences in working memory capacity, the mental scratch pad you use to hold and manipulate information in real time. When your working memory is limited, tasks that require holding multiple pieces of information simultaneously, like following a multi-step instruction or understanding cause and effect across a long chain of events, become genuinely taxing in ways that are invisible to people who've never experienced it. And here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Because of this, many individuals with very low IQ develop what researchers call compensatory cognitive strategies, in plain English, workarounds. The brain, being the astonishing survival machine that it is, finds other routes. Some people develop extraordinarily strong procedural memory. You show them something physical, hands-on, and they can repeat it with remarkable precision. They might not be able to explain why a process works, but their body knows exactly what to do. Think of the factory worker who assembles the same component perfectly, thousands of times, without being able to describe the mechanism in words. That's not a limitation performing despite itself. That's a different kind of intelligence finding its lane. There's also something deeply compelling that psychologists call social mimicry in this population. Because abstract reasoning is harder, many individuals become acutely sensitive to social cues and emotional signals instead. They learn to read rooms. They watch faces. They listen to tone. In some research on individuals with Down syndrome, one of the most common causes of intellectual disability, participants showed above-average emotional intelligence scores on certain social perception tasks. They were picking up on feelings in a room with a sensitivity that surprised the researchers, which makes a kind of beautiful, poetic sense when you think about it. When one channel is quieter, sometimes another turns up. But let's be honest about the hard parts too, because this video isn't here to be naively optimistic. Living with a very low IQ in a world designed for average cognitive functioning is genuinely, relentlessly difficult. And understanding that difficulty with empathy, not pity, empathy, is something psychology asks of us. Consider something called learned helplessness, first described by Martin Seligman in the 1960s.
When someone fails at something repeatedly, especially when they can't understand why they keep failing, they eventually stop trying. Not because they're giving up out of laziness, but because their brain has concluded from overwhelming evidence that their efforts don't produce results. For individuals with very low IQ, this experience can be almost constant. School systems built around verbal abstract learning, paperwork, instructions, bureaucracies, legal documents. Every single day presents new environments where their particular map of the world doesn't match the territory, and failure accumulates. Seligman's research showed that learned helplessness doesn't just affect behavior, it reshapes how the brain interprets future situations. Over time, people stop even scanning for solutions. The brain learns passivity as a survival mode. That's worth sitting with for a second. The people we sometimes label as lazy or unmotivated may be walking around carrying years of neurologically encoded failure. Their stillness isn't indifference. It's an adaptive response to a world that kept saying no in a language they couldn't fully decode. And here's something that almost nobody talks about: the emotional and existential experience of knowing you're different. Many people with moderate intellectual disabilities have enough awareness to recognize that others find things easier than they do. Psychologists call this self-awareness of cognitive difference, and it's a quiet, persistent source of shame and grief for many. Imagine going through life with a constant low-grade awareness that everyone else seems to be reading a book you can't quite make out. That's not an abstract psychological concept. That's a human being lying awake at night, wondering why. Which is exactly why the research on supportive social environments is so striking. When individuals with very low IQ are placed in communities that value their specific strengths, emotional warmth, loyalty, physical skill, consistent routine mastery, something remarkable happens to their functioning. Their adaptive behavior scores go up, their anxiety goes down, their ability to navigate daily life improves measurably. The IQ score doesn't change because it's measuring something structural, but the expression of that person in the world changes dramatically. Psychologists call this the difference between intellectual disability and adaptive functioning, and the gap between the two is largely filled by environment.
In other words, the question was never just, what's wrong with this person? The better question, the scientifically accurate question, is, what does this person need in order to function well? And that reframe changes everything. There's a researcher named Stephen Rice whose work I find quietly profound. He spent decades studying what motivates people with intellectual disabilities and found something that should probably feel obvious but somehow doesn't. They want the same things everyone else does: connection, respect, a sense of purpose, belonging. The psychological needs at the core of every human being don't scale with IQ. They don't get simpler or smaller because cognition is limited. If anything, the research suggests those needs are felt with the same, sometimes greater, intensity. So what does all of this leave us with? Maybe it leaves us with a different way of looking at intelligence itself. We live in a culture that has made IQ, or something like it, the unofficial measure of human worth. We celebrate cleverness, we reward abstraction, we build entire economies around symbolic manipulation, language, code, finance, strategy. And in doing so, we've quietly decided that some people matter more than others, that some minds are more valuable, that some ways of being in the world are more legitimate. Psychology, at its best, pushes back on that. It says intelligence is plural, it is distributed in ways our current measurements barely capture, and the parts of the human experience that matter most, love, loyalty, kindness, the capacity to be genuinely present with another person, those don't show up on any standardized test. The next time you encounter someone who seems to struggle with the things you find easy, I'd invite you to get curious instead of frustrated. Ask what map they're working with. Ask what strengths their particular wiring has built in them that you might be too busy or too abstract to notice. Because if there's one thing a career in psychology teaches you, it's that the most interesting things about people are almost never the things that are easy to measure. If this gave you something to think about, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read them, and conversations there are often better than the video. And if you want more of this kind of deep dive into the quiet, overlooked corners of the human mind, stick around. There's a lot more worth knowing.